swallow or spit, girl. Welcome back to another episode of Millionaire Matchmaker, where we're going to be
Oh my
discussing
god.
Luke Rockhold's singular episode on Millionaire Matchmaker. Um, that is that is the topic of this discussion. Do you remember that, Sriram?
Yeah, I do. It
Did
was.
you see that?
I
Did you
heard it
watch
was
the
edited to
episode?
make him look bad, but I just don't know why he would say that at all.
I think it was, but I don't know, and I kind of hope it wasn't because it was. Okay, shamefully, I actually ended up watching it. I watched the whole thing. I watched the whole episode. I like saw it. I found it online and I watched it. And it was outstanding. It was. I will say it was probably as not awkward as Rockhold has ever been. Like it was probably the most neutral I've ever seen him. But
I mean,
he gave us that winner, which was just amazing.
I've always found Rockhold's awkwardness to be like kind of overrated as long as he's not like actively trying to talk shit. Because like
Uh,
sometimes
I
it's
I think he's just a weird dude. I just think he's kind of socially shy.
well, yeah. I mean,
Um,
when you can get friends just by like walking into a room and being like, "Hello, I am handsome," it's like, why would you develop social skills?
exactly. I mean, questions I've been asking myself for years. Um, okay. Anyway, moving on. We are actually not going to cover much from UFC 247 just because there isn't really too much discussionary material there. This week, we are going to stretch our legs a little bit and we're going to discuss Arnold Allen, who is one of the more, I'm trying to use a word other than underrated, just one of the, like, kind of the lesser known prospects at featherweight. Um, and
I
sort
mean,
of
I'm not
talk about, what would you say?
I'm not even sure he's like he seems like he should be overlooked, but he somehow isn't, and it's just really weird.
But he is an interesting fighter at featherweight, and he comes out of TriStar, and so there's some unique similarities there between him and we say going to say Roy McDonald. And so we're going to talk about Arnold Allen just kind of as a fighter of interest. And then we're going to jump into a UFC 247 preview of what is it, Bektic versus Ige,
Yeah,
Mirsad
that's
Bektic versus Dan Ige.
yeah. This is just kind of an assorted topics one because 246. There's not a ton to say, and my opinions are already kind of out there. But yeah, and the next card is kind of awful, so this is just
Yeah.
one for fun.
And the main event of UFC 247, Jon Jones versus Dominic Reyes. We said we're gonna bring Ryan on and have a big episode dedicated to that because I think it's going to be a pretty substantial fight to discuss. But in our final section, Sriram and I are going to talk a little bit about Jon Jones and sort of where Jon Jones is and where light heavyweight is in this new decade because it certainly feels like, and it certainly looks like, Jon Jones is kind of the last champion standing of the kind of past generation. And he has a very interesting task ahead of him. And so I think there's going to be a lot to mine there, and maybe kind of a prefacing discussion before we really break into Reyes versus Jones and the technical nitty-gritty of that fight. Um, so, without further ado, Suram, Arnold Allen, what are your thoughts?
Uh, yeah, he's so watching a bunch of his fights. He's the McDonald comparison makes a lot of sense because the first thing that you notice about him is just that sort of temperament. In that, like, there's a lot to be said about like Fear is creating like these really calm fighters who just don't want to exchange that much, and that can be a good thing. But he seems like the kind of fighter who might be able to press his advantage more.
Yeah. He is. Well, I'd say he's a unique fighter in those. It's similar to the way that Roy McDonald was a unique fighter. He's physiologically somewhat similar to Rory in the sense that he's pretty tall and long for the division, but he kind of fights low, and so his punches tend to travel almost horizontal. Um, and he is, as you said, he doesn't love exchanging I think he's become a little bit more willing to exchange in recent outings, but he's clinical in the same way that Rory McDonald was clinical, and a lot of that comes from his jab. Now, the unique thing about Allen is that he's a rare example of like a southpaw jabber, where he can hand fight with his lead hand a bit, but he actually has a very nice, lead hand jab as a southpaw. And it's similar he uses it similar to the way that Rory and sometimes even GSP used it, where it's almost more of an option than it is a sort of implied offensive tool, if that makes sense. So he throws it like any other punch, and it can be used to gauge distance, but not always. And it doesn't necessarily serve the same purposes that jabs tend to. Like if you think of someone, like a fighter with a great jab, like Max Holloway or Jose Aldo, Arnold Allen doesn't use his jab in that way. He doesn't really build off of it in terms of combinations, but he does. It is probably his favored tool.
Yeah, I think the way that I would put it, the way I put it before, is that it's more of like kind of an annoyance and a volume tool than it is something like Calvin Kattar, for example, in the same division, has like a really sort of granular jab in the sense that he can, flick it out, he can throw it with power. For Arnold Allen, it's kind of the same each time. So it doesn't, like, you'd expect a southpaw jab to work differently than just like a regular jab because, all the roots are different, you have to get past the hands, but it almost doesn't function like a jab at all.
Yeah. And he's a very interesting technical fighter to watch him because he's someone who I think kind of understands the flow of a fight in the same way that Rory did. He's someone who could he can dictate range very well with his jab. He actually has shown an ability to to counterpunch in some capacity. I think when he was fighting Jordan Rinaldi, like I said, when I was messaging you yesterday, he counterpunched Jordan Rinaldi a fair bit, but a lot of that was Rinaldi just sort of winding up with big single loaded up shots, and then Allen sort of needling in one or two straight shots like the jab of the rear hand. So I don't know if that's really indicative of he's a great counterpuncher in exchanges. More, I think he can pick off opponents who throw at him as long as it's not in super layered exchanges.
I think the Rinaldi fight, if we're going to go with the Rory comparison for Allen, the Rinaldi fight was something like the Ellenberger fight for Rory. Yeah, he was facing an opponent who wasn't like cultured enough to deal with anything he did. It wasn't like he didn't have to push through to get to another gear. It's just that unlike Rory Ellenberger, you could see that when Allen did push into that other gear and just decided to swarm, Rinaldi had no answer, which makes it kind of questionable because it's kind of a thing. You can notice that with like Darren Till too, and that's kind of a weird comparison, but there are certain guys who they can either be like all the way fierce level conservative technical guys, or they can go like all out swarm, I don't care about defense. And it looked like Allen found that balance with Gilbert Melendez, but him not having it with Rinaldi was kind of weird.
Yeah, it did look like at certain points, if he wanted to, he could have gotten Rinaldi out of there just by throwing more. Allen does share some of the same. I think he actually shares some of the same fight DNA as Rory, in the sense that he's not dumb. Like I don't think Arnold Allen is a dumb fighter by any means, but I think he can sometimes get tracked into one technique. Like this is sort of sometimes a TriStar thing where they sort of cycle through their options, and then maybe he gets stuck on one, and then kind of runs it dry. So he may try the same like over the top elbow. I think he tried it on Mads Burnell a few times, and eventually Mads either was like blocking it or slipping it or countering it, and you could kind of see the difference when he fought Mads Burnell between a more coachable rote fighter versus a more fluid fighter. Like a fluid fighter with sort of a unique in-fight rhythm. I like Allen a lot. but I don't know. I'm sort of curious as to what his ceiling is because he doesn't appear to have the same. Well, first of all, it doesn't appear to have the same kind of defensive wrestling that Rory had, where
Yeah, definitely not.
Rory was an excellent. He had an excellent sprawl and was had just a beautiful game off his back, guard game. Allen does not appear to have quite that same level. But he's similar in the sense that his clinical kind of striking doesn't always lead to the most educated of reads, and since he isn't like a super threatening counter puncher in exchanges. I think if someone actually was just able to force him to exchange, they might be able to take him apart.
Yeah, I think it's one thing about I don't know about Fierce's fighters in general to this like particular tendency, but it seems like Allen, he doesn't want people to like swing back at him when he does those little flurries he does. He wants to either be like so he can build defensive moves into his combos the way he does like, that little pull where he like weaves off his rear hand. He does that sort of thing sometimes. So he stays safe, but it's also the sort of thing where you're like he enters in and he wants to just like get in and get out and doesn't want the other guy to do anything but defend. And against someone like, I mean, if you look at the rankings in regards to the whole ceiling thing, there's guys like, Josh Emmett, Jeremy Stevens. Those are guys who are beatable for him because they're like, not the kind of actual boxers. If, to put it in like a weird way, it's like they're not like Mats Burnell where they can actually adapt to what Allen's throwing. They're just going to kind of do the same thing over and over, and Allen can deal with that. But after a point, you're going to get to these power counter punchers like Chan Sung Jung, and even if you go lower in the rankings, someone like Shane Burgos, who's going to make Allen uncomfortable.
Yeah. He even uses like the high elbow guard that Roy used. He is so much like he's so TriStar. Like it is really funny to watch. I said to Sriram, I would love to see Shane Burgos versus Arnold Allen because I would love to see featherweight Lawler versus featherweight McDonald. I think that'd be hilarious to watch. But it'd also be a really interesting fight because in this case, Arnold Allen is a southpaw, and I think he might be able to mitigate some of Shane's jab. It would be an interesting. He'd really have to commit to fighting off the back foot. But Burgos' pressure is still somewhat plodding. It's a winnable fight.
Allen can do stuff like pivot on the outside with that high elbow guard. He did that a bunch against Rinaldi, I think. It was like he just but it's sort of thing where I don't trust Allen enough in like these longer exchanges to be able to say he beats Burgos. But on the other hand, with both Burgos' jab kind of complicated by Allen being southpaw and Allen's jab not having the same sort of angles that Burgos would need for the cross counter that he does all the time, it would be more interesting than I gave it credit for before I talked to you.
I think it would be interesting. Also, I'm just sort of pointing out tactical things, but Allen also does the TriStar thing that I hate, which is because he's so heavily weighted on his jab and because his jab is so uniquely preferential in the way that he throws it, he can't really throw a properly weighted rear hand punch. So his back left foot will always come off the ground when he throws say like a lead left. It's so annoying. GSP and Rory actually had the same issue. I don't know if it doesn't look as bad as the GSP's right hand. If for those people that don't remember, GSP had an ugly ass right hand at one point in time. Like when he was fighting Jake Shields, dude, it was like just hideous. And Rory does that. Rory does the same thing too. I think they've kind of had some of it coached out of him a little bit. But I saw it when I was watching tape on Allen yesterday, and I was like, oh damn it! Like he's so TriStar. I think the Mads Burnell fight was one that Allen was kind of lucky to win. It doesn't look like one he was really winning. The first round was fairly close. I think Mads was probably getting the better of it. In the second round, Mads was just sort of dominated him with wrestling. And then in the third round, Allen was actually able to, sneak in a front choke and get the tap, which was impressive. Like it sort of shows that he's he's not necessarily flappable. Like he's a sort of single-minded fighter. Doesn't really get put off his game plan if things don't go tremendously right, and that's a good trait to have, I think.
I think, yeah, I think it's interesting because Allen, he fights like someone whose game should like build on itself because he's not like a tremendous puncher, but he does like the leg kick stuff, like off the jab or the hand fight. He does the outside leg kick. He body punches a lot, but his game just never really seems to hit that gear where you're like, okay, he's worn down enough. Let's actually turn it up. It's either all like these tiny little bursts where he turns it up and like knocks the guy down, or he just does what he does to Gilbert Melendez, where the guy is like really, really hurt from the leg kicks, like late in the third, and he's just like, let's point fight. I don't care.
And that's sort of why he's not like Allen is not. I mean, Rory was one of the things that Roy always had against him was that Rory was not much of an athlete himself, but he was strong for the division. He wasn't like overwhelmingly, he wasn't Kamaru Usman, but he was a strong fighter. And he could leverage that with his wrestling much of the time. Allen doesn't appear to have that. So he is sort of locked into fighting these kind of patient, controlled bouts. Like I said, I don't know if he's someone who can. I think the Mats Burnell fight might actually prove to be something of an anomaly. I don't know if he's someone who can really turn back. Like, if he has a difficult first round against someone like Shane Burgos, I don't know how he really transitions and comes back from that necessarily. I don't know if he's someone who can really kick that extra gear up.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things about Allen's finishes that kind of feel Ortega-esque in that you're not necessarily going to see that again if you run that fight back 10, 15. You might see it in a different way if like he's like someone like Ortega. That's kind of what I was saying, is that he can, work the body, and like eventually Moicano was going to run into something if it wasn't that guillotine because he was just tired and broken down. But with Allen, it's like Burnell was not on the way to running into anything. He just kind of did.
Yeah, it was a classic prospect submission loss. Like that is absolutely what they look like. Like you'll look good even in your losses. But I like Arnold Allen. It's important to remember that he is 6-0 in the UFC and he's 26 years old. Oh, 26 today. Yeah, look at that.
Yeah. He's been fighting for like.
Or is he 27 today? No, wait, see, 94. No, yeah, he's 26 today. And he's only been fighting for 8 years. Like he's good. Like he is a good prospect. I don't know. We're comparing him to Rory McDonald. He certainly hasn't gotten the opportunity to prove himself at the level that Rory was proven at.
But featherweight's going to be the place where he can, because there are a lot of really interesting fights there.
There are a lot of really interesting fights. Like he would be, I think he's fighting Nick Lentz. Assuming he beats Nick Lentz, he could fight someone like, I don't know. I think Stevens would be a fine fight for him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure they're going to remake Stevens Cater, which means that Stevens is going to leave the top 10. But I really feel like they remake Emmett, and that's not a fight that I love for him, but it's also not a fight that I hate for him.
Yeah, I kind of. The fear that I have would actually more just be, I think Emmett might just blast doubles through him, and he might just take him down because Emmett is a much better athlete. But I would also be very unsurprised to see Arnold just confuse Emmett and just sort of flick his jab, sting his jab, hit the body periodically, and then just limit exchanges to a unbelievably predictable fighter in Josh Emmett. And
Emmett's just
then that would kind of then that might be it. I can't stand Josh Emmett. I think all of us kind of feel that way. But so like I said, that if Arnold Allen beat him, that would mean something, right?
With Emmett's resume right now, which is actually better than it should be, with the Johnson win and the Bektic win, and also Lamas, it's just, I feel like beating him would mean more than it should.
Yeah, I agree. But we'll see when we get there. The point is that like Arnold Allen is a better fighter and he's not going to be the featherweight prospect that jumps out at you. He's not going to be the one that like I think people are going to be clamoring to see more of. He's not blowing the doors off, but he's just solid.
Yeah, right now Right now,
He's
that's Sadiq
solid.
Yusuf.
Yeah, right now it's Yusuf, but he's just solid. He's solid everywhere, and like he might be someone who could surprise. He could surprise people in the sense that he could end up like winning fights that you don't necessarily expect him to. Like I wouldn't actually be shocked to see him beat someone like maybe Calvin Cater. Like if he could actually really mitigate Cater's jab and fight off the back foot and threaten with kicks, like he might. I don't know if he's ready to win that fight yet, but it might be closer than people could suspect, and I would go as far to say as I think it's winnable.
Yeah, it's the
Um,
sort of fight where I'd say Cater is like significantly better at what he does. It's just that Allen isn't necessarily going to be the kind of fighter where you're going to do what you do. That makes
yeah,
sense. It's just going to be like if you look at the entirety of their games, Cater's probably better. It's just Allen has a couple things that are really, really likely to annoy the crap out of Cater.
um, so it's like there are interesting possibilities with Arnold Allen beating Mads Burnell. As kind of weird as that fight was, it means something. And while beating Gilbert Melendez doesn't mean much at this point, the way that he did it was actually very smart and controlled, and in sometimes even surprisingly violent. Um, so I would say, like I said, we have cautious expectations with Arnold Allen.
Yeah, he's
Not Yeah, he's not someone we're expecting to just like just run through the division. He doesn't look like a ready-made title contender, but he is someone that if he keeps winning fights, they're eventually going to have to give him a step up. And like I said, he might actually be something of a spoiler. So he's an interesting one.
yeah, I think it feels like pretty much everyone is kind of underranked at featherweight right now. Like everyone cool because there's Frankie Edgar who's pretty much done, especially at the weight class. There's Renato Moicano who's moving up. There's Jose Aldo who's pretty much done and moving down, which I hate so much, but it's there.
Right.
And yeah, you've got guys like Calvin Cater who are probably top five, who are kind of sitting down at 11, while someone like Yair Rodriguez is sitting at number five. So it's
Right.
just featherweight's due for a mix-up right now, and I think that's something that Allen could really benefit from because you got more violent prospects like Sadiq Yusuf who are like destroying people, and then you've got Arnold Allen who's at least showing the sort of consistency that you'd be wanting from that violent prospect sooner or later.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are, like I said, I wanted to do this segment because I think that he is a he is an interesting prospect who, like I said, greatly resembles Rory McDonald, and that's not a bad comparison. That's not a bad person to be modeling yourself after. He does have some of the same mechanical and even sort of psychological or philosophical issues as Rory, but I think Arnold Allen is probably going to be someone who's going to win. I think he's going to win more fights than he loses. Um, and
Yeah, I'd be comfortable saying that. I think
yeah,
you
and
could
he's
look at
a
yeah.
yeah. I think he's gonna. I think he's someone who's shown aptitude for MMA, and his style, while it is more control based than really risk based, and that's not going to thrill people. I think he might be someone. He might be end up being something of a hardcore favorite.
Yeah, I think that's also where the contrast with Burgos comes in, like really, really handy because that fight would be really good, not just because featherweight Lawler and featherweight McDonald, because they're almost opposite philosophically. If you look at someone like Burgos, who's pretty much constantly in the other guy's face, he's ready to get hit, even if he has a game that's built not necessarily to get hit, he's ready and he's prepared for it. And if you look at someone like Arnold Allen, who's kind of built the opposite way, and it's like I could see both of them having different kinds of successes against different kinds of opponents. Like Arnold Allen isn't going to run into the counters of Calvin Cater the way Shane Burgos did, but he's also not going to step inside and roast his body the way Shane Burgos did. So, yeah, featherweight's awesome.
They are kind of diametrically opposing fighters, and yeah, hopefully sometime soon the UFC will stop putting JDS in fight night main events and start flexing some featherweight and bantamweight talent. But let's move on. I think we're good on that one.
Yeah.
But we're not leaving the featherweights just yet, because this next one is an interesting one. Mirsad Bektic versus Dan Ige. Sriram, why have we both been downplaying Dan Ige so much?
It was the Arce fight. Speaking of a good southpaw jabber, Julio Arce is. I rewatched that fight. It's one of the best ones I've ever seen in terms of southpaw jabs, and it made Ige look awful. And I don't know, Ige might have been awful then, but watching his most recent fight, he's been really, really impressive in a way that I really wasn't expecting from him. Because, like, when you look at his record, it's like I can see someone like Kevin Aguilar and be like, yeah, that's a cool win. But then you watch the fight, it's like he's, landing combos to the body. He's doing this sick catch and pitch counter stuff that I don't think I've seen done consistently from a lot of people. He seems like the kind of guy who he's either been quietly good the entire time and Julio Arce was just a level above, which is possible because Julio Arce is, as I reiterate, the best, or he's just worked really hard to improve. And that's a good contrast to Mirsad Bektic, who's I don't know if he might have stagnated, or it might just be that any improvements haven't had the chance to manifest with his specific athletic deficiencies.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat. I remember watching UFC 220, and I was just watching the card. I turned it on, and I couldn't tell Dan Ige or Julio Arce apart because I just turned it on at round 3 and they looked like brothers and I was like, I don't know who's who. But then, one of them started jabbing the other and I was like, oh, okay, that guy's winning. So that guy must be Arce because the commentary's talking him up. And I think that was the point where I was like, okay, I don't really see much from Ige. Like he looks pretty impotent in that fight. But he's on a 4-fight winning streak and he's like looking good. I still don't think he's much of an athlete. I don't think he's really physically strong. I'm not sure how durable he really is. I don't think he's particularly explosive. He's fast. He's got good hand speed. And he actually looked really fast in comparison to Kevin Aguilar, although that might just be Kevin Aguilar being, pretty slow.
Yeah, Aguilar's middling as an athlete himself, so.
Yeah. But Ige's like you said, he's throwing combinations to the body. He's more comfortable under fire in terms of he can catch and pitch. He's he looks like he sort of knows what he's keying in on. He's learning to sit down on his punches. I think he dropped Aguilar like twice. He even he even threw like a body head lever combination against Aguilar. And then in the fights that he hasn't been, sort of locked into kickboxing matches, he's just taken him down and wrecked him. So he took down Mike Santiago and just smashed him in under a minute. I think he knocked down or hurt Danny Henry and then immediately took him down and tapped him out. I don't really know what his best analog is, but I kind of want to say Bilal, remember the name Muhammad.
Yeah, I can see that actually. Where
I don't know if it's like too much in terms of style, but like it kind of feels apt. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you have it's just the meh athlete kind of outworking the other guy by just being slightly smarter. I'm writing the Benil Dariush article right now, so I think you could kind of say a less extreme version of him. But again, not really in terms of style, just overall philosophical development.
Yeah, and I imagine there's a ceiling. Like I don't, like I have to admit, I don't think Ige can just kind of workman-like his way up the ladder at featherweight. I think he'll eventually hit someone like, he may hit someone like Dyer, who's just insanely quick and super dynamic and super unstructured, but he might just yeah, exactly.
That'd be so depressing.
Or I mean, who are the other? I mean, shit, he could hit Josh Emmett. He could, God forbid he fights someone like Max Holloway. But he is someone who, again, maybe not too dissimilar to Arnold Allen. He's just solid, and he's kind of this overperforming under athlete. And like I said, I don't after he's rattled off 4 victories after the Arce fight, so we're sort of curious as to what his ceiling really is. The question is Mirsad Bektic that ceiling, Sriram?
I don't. My lean is no, but I also think it's going to be a fight where we see whether Mirsad Bektic plus EPO is his ceiling, because I have a feeling that is. If you look at the Aguilar fight, he looks scrambly at some points. Like, it's really weird because there were, like, at one point he had Mount, and Aguilar just kind of got up underneath him and he fell off and he just spent the rest of the round on bottom. But there was another point where he would not allow himself to be on the bottom. And that second one is obviously preferable for Bektic, not just because Bektic is a genuinely good top player, but because you want to make Bektic work as hard as he possibly can, harder than he possibly can, because after a round of that, he's just going to be a shell. So I think it's going to be one where either, first 8 minutes, Bektic just, pounds him out, beats him up, gets him out, or it's going to be something that's unreasonably close for what we used to think Bektic was.
Yeah, I think that's worth addressing a little bit, is that, Bektic, I, like a lot of people, I overestimated Bektic. I don't know if I thought he was like further along in his development, or if he just wasn't ever as complete as I seem to think that he could have been. But I think he's shown some very significant holes in his game, one of which has been addressed, which is his chin, and he doesn't appear to have much of one. Because not even just the Darren Elkins thing where he was exhausted by the end, but like the Josh Emmett knockout, and then even Chaz Skelly pretty much knocked him out with an illegal knee. And I know you're gonna say it's illegal, but like
He shouldn't get knocked out by that. It wasn't like a massive.
He was also dropped.
Crowder
He was
knee.
also dropped by a right hand like moments before. And Bektic is really, I've said on Twitter, he's super, super tense. And he seems, as you said, he seems to fade late. And he's also not a terribly difficult fighter to read. Like, I think he's actually pretty rote as a striker. Like, I think TriStar was supposedly helping him in terms of like kind of managing his pace, teaching control, because a lot of times Bektic could just get wild, and that was a lot of his issues, where he would, even against Godofredo Pepe, who is in a lot of senses a less well-schooled striker, but is probably a more comfortable one. Like, and even Josh Emmett, like Bektic would just load up on his punches, and Emmett and Pepe would maybe just throw at him in the middle of those combinations, and like the next 2 or 3 of Bektic's punches would just sort of go flying through the air and not hit anything, and Bektic wouldn't even realize what happened.
I mean, I think, like, I kind of get the sense that Bektic, his limitations aren't like massive, but they are the kind where you can't really afford to fight dumb. Because if he's like, for example, against Josh Emmett, he was standing out in the outside, jabbing a bunch, feinting, basically like cosplaying Max Holloway. And all that's fine if it's like facilitating towards what you do best. But he didn't shoot once, if I remember correctly. He spent the entire time just jabbing at Josh Emmett and just like doing his thing. And it's like, there's no reason for him to be spending all that time out in the open when he's clearly better in another area. So that's why his chin gave out, because he was like, you can't afford to do that against a power puncher like Emmett when your chin is Bektic's chin. So it's like he has advantages in a lot of places. It's just that he doesn't have the sort of margin that he would need to like experiment the way he does, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. He's also been somewhat inconsistent in just getting to the cage. Like, he doesn't fight a lot. He fought once in 2019, he fought twice in 2018, once in 2017, and then we're kind of getting back to when he was still considered a prospect.
But still once in 2016.
Yeah, he's 2-2 in his last 4, and they're both losses have been by knockout. And his last wins, Ricardo Lamas, Godofredo Pepe, and then Russell Doan. Like, these are not And these are not names that like really ring out any kind of, leave any kind of impression.
This is how I'd expect Cain Velasquez to do at featherweight, because
A little bit,
you've
yeah.
yeah, you've kind of got the sense that like everyone's like, he's got so much potential, and like his performances were really good like earlier in his career, but then he's kind of settling into a point where he's A, not fighting much, and B, he's running into people who he can't just, or he isn't just athleting and wearing down with pace.
Yeah. And so this kind of begs the question, like you sort of have an underperforming super athlete in Bektic against an overperforming sub athlete in Dan Ige. And honestly, given the sort of grit and determination that Ige has shown, I think I trust him to actually just hang in there with Bektic. And if he does, he seems like someone who's eminently capable of just figuring out Bektic's extremely predictable rhythms. Like, I think we'll probably, similar to the Aguilar fight, we may see him working in more body shots as the fight goes on. I think, he is someone who's probably able to catch and pitch some of Bektic's counters. I think Bektic has great hand speed, but I think Dan Ige is also, surprisingly fast. And this is just kind of, if Bektic loses, I think this will be something of a, I don't know. I think it will kind of be a permanent move from you are an interesting prospect to you are just kind of a guy.
I kind of think Emmett was that, because like if you look at the guys Emmett's beaten, yeah, it's Ricardo Lamas, who's been on a downslide for a bit, and I kind of value a win over him, but it was also like super short notice. Like I'm not sure how much to make of that. And then you look at Michael Johnson, who's Michael Johnson, and was still like styling all over him for like 2 rounds, and then he did a Michael Johnson. And then it's Bektic, who's rapidly reaching busted prospect levels after a loss already to Darren Elkins. So you're kind of reaching the point where you could say this is the test for whether like Bektic is a level above the I try hard type people, but I'm not sure.
Are you going to be something, or are you just going to be a guy?
Yeah, and I think it's like one thing that I could tell about Ige, even when I didn't rate him at all, when like watching the Arce fight, it's that he's pretty durable when he's like taking damage, and he's not gonna like lose heart. He was still trying at the end of the Arce fight, even though Arce knew everything about him, and that consistency is what Bektic lacks. Because if you look at Arce, he's gonna he's gonna southpaw jab, he's gonna keep doing his thing, and he's gonna build off it, and that's what gave Ige so much trouble in that fight. Where Bektic, he's gonna do his thing for 8 minutes, and then he's just gonna stop. So Ige is gonna be there unless he takes like absolutely hellacious Khabib MJ type damage, and he's just not there anymore. He's gonna be there, and he's gonna do his thing. So I feel like I might be trying a bit too hard to like justify a quote unquote mediocre fighter to beat this former super prospect, but it seems very, very likely.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree. I don't like the way that Bektic has trended. I really, I think his lack of activity. I think the fact that against Lamas and against Elkins, we've watched. He is someone who will just sort of keep trying the same thing over and over and over and over again, and if it doesn't work, he's not really much of an adjuster. He's not really an adaptable fighter. And Ige is someone who looks like he is. So I'm gonna pick Ige by decision. And I have to say I kind of hope Ige wins. Like I just like Bektic doesn't look
It's just
like
the kind of story that you appreciate.
Yeah, exactly. This would be like
Yeah.
this would be like a Noak versus Morono type fight, where you have one guy who's just athletically outclassed, and he just he wins it just because he wants it more. So
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll pick Ige like 3rd round finish just because, it's Bektic and he's going to fall off a cliff. I think it's going to be like, in terms of betting, the odds look pretty much even, which is actually pretty respectful to Ige and how much he's, either improved or had the chance to look good over the years. I think it's going to be either, Ige straight up or Bektic finish inside like the first 2 rounds.
Yeah, I think you're right. So another interesting one, like sort of big questions surrounding both guys. I would not at all be surprised to see. I would not at all be surprised to see Bektic just bowl him over. But I'm gonna pick the workman here. So with that, I think we're gonna move on to part 3, and this is gonna be a bit of an interesting one because it's kind of unstructured. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Jon Jones and where Jon Jones is at and where we think he's probably going in this next decade. So, Sriram, we were talking earlier.
Yeah.
And I brought up a picture of I think it was taken in 2011, of a roster of champs in the UFC. And I think this was before flyweight was around, but it was Dominic Cruz at 135, Jose Aldo at 145, Frankie Edgar at 155, GSP at 170, Anderson Silva at 185, Jon Jones at 205, and then Cain Velasquez at 265. And I know a lot of people consider that the greatest roster of champs in UFC history, and I think there's some sound logic behind that. But it's interesting looking at that photo now because most of these divisions have had, 2 or 3 runs of champs. Like, almost, in fact, every single division has had some major change-ups. Like, Stipe's more or less become the guy at heavyweight. Middleweight was just bizarre for a while. Welterweight had, I think Hendricks came in at the end of the GSP era, and then Lawler had his amazing run, and then we kind of know where we've gone from there. Lightweight's been bizarre. Featherweight's probably been one of the more streamlined, I'd say, but that's
You still have that interim title stuff.
There was still some McGregor stuff in there that was weird. And then 135 had TJ and Cody, but like I think Cejudo's kind of severed the line behind them. So you have Jon Jones, who is kind of the last man standing. And he is really he's really the only one who's left. Like everyone else is kind of aged out. Or retired in some ways. And a lot of people would look at that and be just impressed beyond belief that that he's been able to hold this belt for so long. I think he's won like 14 title fights. But it's also begging the question, like, where is he really at right now? Like, what does this all mean? Because in his last couple fights between, Thiago Santos and then, hilariously and sadly, Anthony Smith, he's looked pretty unimpressive.
Careless might be
careless is a good word. Yeah, pretty careless and pretty like, is this really the way that you're going about winning these fights? So what do you think about where he's at?
I think we're kind of sitting at a point where usually at a good division, we would have seen someone come up who's adapted to like Jon Jones, the meta, in a way that no other light heavyweight has. Because you can look at someone like Dominic Reyes and compared to Thiago Santos, he's like Santos Mark 1.5 and be like, yeah, he's a bad matchup for Jones. But if you look at a division like featherweight, you've got someone like Jose Aldo, who was just totally dominant over like an entire era, and then you had someone like Max Holloway and Conor McGregor who come up specifically adapted to Aldo. And you're not really getting that with Jon Jones because he's at light heavyweight and there just isn't the talent capable of that sort of adaptation. So he's cleaned out the entire place. And now he's just facing guys who no one cares about, with the exception now of Reyes, who might actually have a shot. It's weird, and I understand why he might be apathetic without, big feuds like Daniel Cormier. But even that wasn't compelling competitively. It was just compelling personally. So it's just an annoying time to be watching Jon Jones.
Yeah. So like I said, because he's the last champ standing, he's also kind of the last point of contact to this sort of generation of MMA. I think more or less we've moved on. And it's starting to feel, as you pointed out, that the light heavyweight division is starting to move on. Like I think you brought up a really good point that no one has really figured out. No one has come up, no one has come up like, this is the foil to Jon Jones, except maybe Rumble, but Rumble never got the opportunity. But there is now almost a decade of footage on Jon Jones as champion. Like, this is not someone like Volkanovski, where we kind of kept looking at Volkanovski like a static concern out of the Mendes fight and then out of the Aldo fight. And then, after the Holloway fight, we sort of see that he just keeps pulling back layers, and it's like, oh wow, we see how like deep his game goes, but it's just we didn't really know that, and you can't really pick it until you see it, right? Like, I don't think anyone really picked that fight with a confident read, or a really accurate read, and it was just kind of because there was a lot of stuff that Volkanovski can do that we didn't know he could do. But that's not the case
the
here.
Volkanovski picks were kind of just Volkanovski might wrestle him.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think many of them were very good picks. But that's not the case with Jon Jones, right? Like, Jon Jones, I feel like as much as any fighter on the roster, we have seen the ins and outs of Jon Jones's game. Like, we know him really, really well. And that's helpful as an analyst. But it also makes for an interesting proposition because, like, when Thiago Santos showed up, he wasn't a prospect. In fact, he was kind of the opposite. He was an older fighter who came into this division late in his career and just figured out that he could just make a killing matchup going through it, just like a killing contender going through it, because he's insanely violent and, really powerful and athletic, and the division's not very good. But he didn't build his style around Jon Jones. And it's just more of an indictment of the division and Jon Jones, that Jon was so uncomfortable dealing with just kind of an all-around okay kickboxer, right?
Yeah, it was just like the Brazilian Muay Thai sort of mold has existed for a long, long time. So this isn't any sort of like specific, this is how I beat Jon Jones type thing. It was just this Brazilian Muay Thai guy came up randomly and he just happened to give Jones a really tough fight. What makes it interesting is that Reyes is like kind of the same sort of, outside kicky counterpunchy guy. So it's like if Jones faced Gus the first time, and then after that it was someone who was better than Gus at doing what Gus did. So it's exciting in a way that Jones hasn't been since, I would venture to say, like, I don't even know, Gus 1? Jesus. Because I think a lot of us knew that DC2 was kind of a foregone conclusion, given what we know about DC. And since then, there hasn't been a compelling fight for Jones, at least not one where he hasn't been a compelling favorite, even in the eyes of the analysts.
Yeah. That's sort of why I wanted to bring this discussion to the fold, because the question about, like, what does Jon Jones do against just functional fighters is still something of an open one. And because he's been here so long, you have I think the spectrum to beating Jon Jones has to be somewhere between Gustafsson and Santos, right?
Yeah,
And
it's going to be I think it might just be someone like Santos, but much better, I guess.
Maybe even a little bit better. Like maybe
Maybe
not
even
even.
not better at all, because Santos arguably did.
Yeah, right. But the thing that's the indictment here is that Jon has also kind of not really shown much of his famous like fight IQ and adaptability. I don't think it's as present now. Like we don't really get to see it because in that Santos fight, he didn't really make any notable adjustments in the fight. He just kind of did what he does, and I guess to some people he just kind of outworked Santos at range by just kind of pecking away at him. And
It was
my
such a
thing is like
weird fight.
it's an incredibly weird fight and a weird performance from Jones, who still never really got it under control. And that's kind of that's sort of what I'm indicating here is that if Jon Jones's durability is still intact, when he loses, it might not be this sort of big knockout destruction that everybody wants. It might just be him being annoyed or just kind of being befuddled, like
Yeah,
just
I mean,
getting his legs
it's like
kicked, and like an opponent can just kind of frame off the clinch and then goes back to
that
kicking
over
his
and
legs.
over.
Yeah, and just that, and like he might not, like he doesn't have, because the functional tools in his game are so kind of janky and weird. He doesn't have much of an ability to adapt to an opponent if they don't just give him his fight right off the bat. And I'm not even sure what his fight is anymore because
Yeah, that's the
he's
weird
not.
thing. It's that if he's he used to be a really aggressive sort of wrestler, and now he's just kind of sitting at range if he doesn't get a really easy entry.
I don't even. It looks like even that part of his game, not only not it's not just the entries, because even back as far as like even in the, I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe the Rashad fight. Like you could see that his entries were starting to leave him, and it was like, oh, okay, he can only really fight in this one way when you basically give him this fight. Otherwise, he's going to just sort of stick to his B game, which is a chipping and pecking kickboxing game that's not really all that good, but is still annoying. The thing is, I think he's
Yeah,
starting to switch. I think that B game is starting to become his A game, and
I think he's
I
still
don't.
better. Like, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I agree that he's better. I think he's still a much better clinch fighter and wrestler than he is striker. I'm saying that doesn't seem to be what he's like this. If he's just fighting with his preference, that doesn't seem to be how he's going about it. You know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Like there were, at
Yeah,
least with fights like the DC fights, you can see him looking for the clinch. As ugly as the clinch entries were, or against Gustafsson in the rematch, like watch that. You could see him fighting for clinch entries. As ugly as they were, at least they were there. When he hit a reactive
yeah,
double on Gus, and he was able to find some wrist control inside on DC. But like that doesn't even seem to be how he's winning fights anymore. And I agree that the entry point is an interesting one, that when guys don't just give him a silver platter with which to walk in on, he can't really enforce it. But I think he's just growing more and more comfortable settling into being a C minus kickboxer.
yeah. I think it's that he might have just bought his own hype with the DC fights. I think that's actually like I don't. I generally don't like looking at fighters from like a sort of psychological, oh, he like really believed this and he went this way thing. But it seems kind of necessary with Jones because any other way, it's just totally inexplicable how his game is developed. It just like unless some part of his game he just like totally forgot it for no reason, and right now he's just secretly a bad top player, which doesn't make any sense. It's something like he just bought his own hype from all the commentary that he's a really good striker now, but then he runs into Thiago Santos, who isn't DC and isn't just gonna like run at him or like square up and walk at him and just eat every body shot, and he's just I'm still the best one. I should be able to do this, so I'll just keep doing it.
Yeah. It's hard to say why this went the way that it did, but I'm really cautious, and I am gonna, maybe a bit of a spoiler pick, but like I don't actually think Jones is gonna be holding the belt that much longer. If his last couple fights have been any indication, like I don't think it's gonna take that much for someone to figure him out, right? Like, because basically all Thiago Santos would have to do is improve a little bit and he wins. Like,
He might just
if
have to not be injured.
Yeah, don't get your knee busted up and you probably win that fight. He may have won it anyway. And the same thing, like it's sort of the same thing with the Gustafsson fight. Like if Gus could deal with being pushed back at all, like,
well, I feel like
might have
that's
been able to
kind
win
of
that
a
fight.
bit bigger one. Like, I think you could look at someone like Gustafsson and say he's equipped to give Jones some trouble because of like his length and stuff, and like, being actually able to box, if only a little bit, and like very limited specific context. But I think Jones is always going to be a much better he's going to be a better rematch fighter than his opponent, even if he's not necessarily going to be a necessarily good rematch fighter, just because it's the nature of light heavyweight. You don't tend to get really adaptive fighters. Jones is one of the better ones, and even now he's not that adaptive. So you're kind of going into like, I don't think Gustafsson's ever going to beat Jon Jones. I think Thiago Santos can, and I think Dominic Reyes might be that version of Thiago Santos who we're like, yeah, he's not bad, and he can do the things that Santos did.
Yeah. And so that's just kind of it's just an interesting thing to consider before we go into this fight and entering this decade, because Jon Jones has been champ for a long time. Even when he wasn't holding the belt at 205, everybody knew he was the best 205er that there was. But he's, given the way that he's decided to kind of settle into fighting, I don't think it's really tremendously sustainable, because he fights negatively. If someone really figures out a solution to a linear kick, they can probably take him apart. That's one of the reasons that Rumble was interesting, because Rumble was something, a counter kicker. But there are some serious questions surrounding Jon Jones, and if he actually answers them positively, if he beats Reyes and then Anderson and I don't know who else, who's another name that's like vying for a title shot right now, Rakic, whatever, Rakic,
Ozdemir.
Sure, like, well, someone like that, that actually might be a pretty impressive run for him, because given the way that he's been trending. But I don't see it happening. I think we're getting to the end of the line with Jon Jones. If his last couple fights have been any indication, I think we're so close to having someone just figure him out. And it doesn't have to, it's probably not going to be like a huge pace war. It's probably not going to be a like a big highlight reel knockout that everyone's looking for. It's probably just going to be, he's just going to get frustrated and just be confused as like, why is my game suddenly not working? Like, it's been working so well this whole time. Why is it suddenly not working against this new class of opponent?
Yeah, I still think that light heavyweight is kind of too weak in order to have the talent to develop a specific answer to Jon Jones, the way like Johnny Hendricks was to GSP, or the way Max Holloway and Conor McGregor were to Jose Aldo.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's kind of just a function of chance at this point, and that's catching up to Jon Jones, because first it was just Brazilian Muay Thai Thiago Santos who was doing his thing, and then that was an answer. It wasn't necessarily like the best answer, and it wasn't even necessarily an answer that worked like super, super well, because eventually, Santos, even if he wasn't injured, Santos wasn't like working at like a great connection rate. It was just something that kind of worked better than whatever someone else did. But now you've got Dominic Reyes. And I don't think Reyes was like specifically developed to beat Jon Jones the way, like the way Volkanovski, as you mentioned, specifically developed his game to beat Max Holloway. It's just he has that kind of game. And eventually you're going to run into that kind of matchup. It's just that Jon Jones has, it's not often that you see someone decline as a champion to the point where we've seen Jon Jones do that. Because after like one guy figures out the answer, you're generally going to get someone else. Like after Max Holloway had that weird showing against Frankie Edgar, you had Alexander Volkanovski who showed up and just exploited every single one of those vulnerabilities because lower divisions can do that. It's just that Jon Jones is operating in a class of himself while also slowly leaving that class.
Yeah. Like that's I agree pretty much down the line. But it does feel like the division is kind of starting to put their games together in a way that is functional and solid, and that might be all it takes.
Yeah, it
So
might just be like a metagame type thing where, like, for example, if you look at someone like Dominic Cruz who comes into like the current bantamweight division, I don't think it goes nearly as well for him as it did in the past because just the games change. And light heavyweight might be hitting a point where it's not necessarily good, but the game is changing to a point where Jon Jones just isn't the guy to deal with it. Like Dominic Cruz, he was a genuinely great champion, and like I wouldn't say anything about him the way I say about Jon Jones being like, kind of not it. But Dominic Cruz was it, and he's still it. It's just not the sort of it that beats Jimmy Rivera or Marlon Moraes or Peter Yan. It's that kind of thing, but at a lower level at light heavyweight.
yeah. So again, interesting standing, a unique standing, and one that is, again, I don't know how much more we're gonna see out of this type of in this sort of situation. I don't know how many more dominant champions we're really gonna have. It seems like as time has gone on, having a champion just hold the belt for years seems to be a thing of the past. The sport's just too accelerated for that. Like I don't think anybody's belt in the UFC, anyone who's holding the belt right now, I don't think anybody is safe. Not Henry
Yeah,
Cejudo,
I think.
not Volkanovski, not Adesanya. Like, maybe Kamaru Usman if he gets past Leon, but like I don't. And I guess could be potentially if he retires soon, but like I don't think that anyone is really in a safe position as champion, and it's just a function of the sport accelerating and improving in such a rapid way.
Yeah,
So
I think if you took someone like as skilled as Prime Jose Aldo and you put him in the current division, he could, like, he'd probably be a champion for at least a little bit, right? But you're also not going to get like him ruling the division for a literal decade the way you did. It's just not how that works anymore. Even if he's still the most skilled, there's just certain guys who are smart enough to do what guys like Mark Hominick did not.
yeah, yeah. So he's in a very, very unique position, and there's a lot of attention on him, especially after, given the way that he's trended, given like how he's, like I say, he hasn't really been improving. In a lot of ways, he's been regressing. I think it just sort of feels like the end of the line. And spoiler alert, I'm picking Reyes in a couple weeks. Like, I'm not doing it with 100% confidence, but like I'm picking
Yeah.
Reyes to win, and it's just a lot of it is based on the fact that I just sort of I don't know how much I trust Jon Jones right now.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in the same place. I think Reyes could, do the light heavyweight, but if someone's beating Jon Jones, I'll put it that way. If someone's going to beat Jon Jones, Reyes is the best candidate we have coming up right now.
I agree, and I think that's all I got. What about
Yeah,
you?
I'm good on this end.
So this, like I said, this was a little bit more of an unstructured one. We just kind of wanted to stretch our legs and talk a little bit, but I think it's an interesting one. A lot of relevant, lot of relevant discussion here, and some interesting things to consider before we go into uh UFC. What is it? 247, I think.
Yeah, 47.
247. Yeah. Um, these are just things you got to keep in mind, and things we need to be, uh, you know, things that you need to be wary of, because as the UFC is going to sell you on Jon Jones being, the greatest undefeated champion in, history. Um, I think Sriram, myself, and I'd say the rest of our staff, were a little bit more reticent. So anyway, thank you for listening.
Yep. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you whenever next time is, because the cards coming up are not great, but we'll see you whenever next time is. Thanks for joining us.